Hello, my name is Thomas, and thank you very much for downloading this episode of British Culture, Albion Never Dies. This episode is called F. It's for fish and chips, and what else could it be? This was the majority consensus, starting off with Mr. Easy Smiles and Expensive Watches. That's his name on Instagram. Thank you very much for suggesting that, and he was the first in because he suggested the F topic immediately after listening to E is for Elgar, and 007 Islander, also on Instagram, suggested this topic as well, and I think one of my friends in China, Kane in Fuzhou, I think he suggested this, but we talk a lot. I think that was in the conversation. But anyway, credit is where credit is due. And again, thank you to Mr. Easy Smiles and Expensive Watches for being on it so quickly. We will, of course, cover a range of other subjects, as we normally do. But the first one just really had to be fish and chips. So, why is it such a big deal? Why do we go in for it? And I really think it's because we're an island nation. Actually, a lot of my childhood in the UK was away from the coast. I lived in the Midlands, and I lived in North Yorkshire, but away from the coast. And, well, I did live in East Anglia. I guess that is fairly close to the coast, but that's actually in the bit that's further away. So again, I wouldn't say it was a huge part of my upbringing. But when I was at university, I joined a University Royal Naval Unit, and I ended up being on the North Sea patrols and so on. And that really introduced me, first of all, to the North Sea, but also to all the beautiful, beautiful little villages and towns all along the northeast coast. And of course, great cities such as Newcastle and Hull. But there, I was introduced to real fish and chips. I feel that in, say, the middle of England, and perhaps even in London, you don't get the best fish and chips. But all along the northeast coast, you rarely, rarely do. And that's really my connection to fish and chips and my introduction to what I'd say is the best of fish and chips. Because, of course, fish needs to be fresh, right? You can taste it. And so, in the middle of England, I'd say there isn't such a tradition. And I was watching a documentary called Great British Railway Journeys, and it's presented by Michael Portillo, a presenter I really, really like. And in the first series, episode 4, Pontefract to Bridlington, he talked about the white fish fleet and also explained how the railways are connected to fish and chips. It's something I'd never really thought about, is that before the days of railway, transporting fish from the coast further inland was very, very difficult. At least to keep it fresh was very, very difficult. But the creation of the railways in the Victorian era allowed fish to be moved around the country much faster. So you could get fresh fish in the middle of England, which had just been caught pretty recently in the North Sea. So the creation of the railways really influenced our eating habits, moving food around. I suppose we think of that in the modern day of having, fresh avocados from wherever in the world we get them, no matter where we are, even in England where they don't, to my knowledge, actually, to my knowledge, they do grow, because I used to grow avocados. It was quite hard to get fruit from them. Anyway, fish and chips. I'd really recommend that series, The Great British Railway Journeys by Michael Portillo, because he looks at England from the Victorian era, where, if you listen to the last episode, a lot of our menswear comes from that time, a lot of other traditions come from that time. We might talk about Christmas later in the year and how much of that comes from the Victorian era. At least the traditions we think about normally with Christmas often come from that era. And when we really talk about our eating habits, what we think of traditional food, fish and chips, it comes from that era too. But I like Michael Portillo. He goes to these little places like Bridlington, talks to people, historic shops, historic industries, and really gets some good local knowledge, as a former politician should be able to talk to anybody from anywhere and get some really useful local knowledge. He does talk about the Cod War, first coined in 1958. This was a war between, I think, Britain and Iceland, and it was a series of kind of conflicts, I'd say negotiated conflicts, but some bashing of boats out in the sea as well. And it did involve the Royal Navy. So I was just reading online, I had a quick look at all of these topics. But in February 1960, the First Lord of the Admiralty stated that the ships near Iceland, the Royal Navy ships near Iceland, had expended £500,000 worth of oil since the start of the new year. So in 2 months, £500,000 worth of oil, and a total of 53 British warships had taken place trying to protect our fishermen going where we thought they should be allowed. There have been a series of conflicts, I say 50s, the 70s, real conflicts, ships bashing each other, unfortunately some deaths. We call it the Cod War. Something perhaps worth looking into. I don't feel this is the episode for looking into it. I know I say that a lot, but do tell me which of these throwaway topics you're interested in, and they will cycle back. But it shows the importance of it, right? We've had a war over fish, because we love fish and chips so much. As I say, the northeast coast is where I think the best fish and chips are. If anyone disagrees, I think you all know where to find me. You can find me on Instagram at FlemingNeverDies. I've also have an email which is the same name as this podcast, albionneverdies@gmail.com. And if you see me in the street, just stop me and say, hey, no, I don't think the northeast is the best fish and chips, if you say so. I do think Hong Kong has some very, very good fish and chips, but of course it tends to be different fish. And why do you have such good fish? I'd say it's because of a cold sea. The North Sea is shockingly cold, and cold water, I don't know how common this knowledge is, but cold water has more oxygen in it. You know, if you boil a kettle, it gets hot and the oxygen goes out. Cold water has a lot more oxygen, which means that you get much bigger fish. You get a different type of fish due to the size. So I'd say that part of the cold water, we often think, but warm water would be so nice, we could go to, say, Spain and go swimming, which is nice on holiday, but the cold water does give us really good fish. And therefore our national dish, well, that's much debated. Is it curry? Is it fish and chips? Is it beef Wellington? Fish and chips seem to be the consensus. As I say, I think 3 people told me fish and chips. So that's the headline topic for today. But I am going to go fairly quickly on to the others. Again, Easy Smiles and Expensive Watches got his in first, so I'm talking about them first as well. He suggested Fortnum & Mason. Now, I tend to think of the really expensive shops in London as, Harrods, very flash. Fortnum & Mason, perhaps more refined. That would be my personal take on them. Fortnum & Mason does, of course, supply to 2 royal households, and I don't think Harrods does any more. Which, gives it some points. Harrods, I go around and I do see people from all over the world going to buy the most expensive things imaginable. I know that in the 60s, Harrods used to have a baby elephant, just to prove that you could buy anything you wanted at Harrods. Whereas Fortnum & Mason, as I say, it has a tea shop. It tends to be the more refined of the two. I have met somebody who looks down on Harrods. I don't know, they're both pretty pricey. I'm not sure if I'd look down on either of them. But I started looking at the history, who is Fortnum and who is Mason. So I just looked at this on their website. They said, our legacy began in 1705 by Hugh Mason from a small store in St James's Market and a spare room in his house, and the Fortnum family, who had arrived in London as high-caliber builders, reinvigorating Mayfair in the wake of the Great Fire. I really like the fact that it says high-class builders, not just builders. Okay, William Fortnum, who was quite the entrepreneur, also took a post as a footman in Queen Anne's household. Again, key part of the story, like all great exercises in creation, Fortnum & Mason began with light. The insistence of Queen Anne's household on fresh candles every night spelled a legitimate perk for an enterprising footman. Spare palace wax to sell on. By 1705, William Fortnum's enlightened skyline had melted down into enough to leave royal service and start a business with his landlord, Hugh Mason. The rest, as they say, is grocery. I think that's a really cool origin story, and of course that's what's plastered across their website. You can go take a look, along with some of their extraordinary claims. They claim to have invented the Scotch egg in 1738, but one thing that seems beyond dispute is that in 1886 they bought the entire stock of 5 cases of a new product made by H.J. Heinz. Fortnum & Mason became the first store in Britain to stock tins of baked beans. Now, this is fantastic. I'm in the United States, and after a few months I went to a special exotic market, and one of the most precious exotic things I got, apart from Irish tea, is It's not Fortnum and Mason. H.J. Heinz's Heinz Baked Beans. So this fun fact really spoke to me. Again, founded in 1707, quite a bit of history. By comparison, Harrods was founded in 1849, so a relative newcomer. And that great British institution, Marks and Spencer's, in 1884. So yeah, Fortnum and Mason far predates the Victorian era, and was already an establishment, as I say, when Queen Victoria came to the throne. So we get so much from that era, but Fortnum and Mason is something even older. I have been, and what I bought was the classic. I bought some tea at Fortnum and Mason. Okay, again, headline topics. Mr. Easy Smiles and Expensive Watches suggested football, but I think I did English Premier League in the last episode, thanks to Jason Kim, who is JASXON88 on Instagram, and a great fella. But yeah, so football, I don't want to talk about it again, but I might mention something I didn't mention last time, which was the shopping centre in Liverpool. There's a great shopping centre, I guess you'd call it a mall, called Liverpool One. So naturally their great rival Everton has a shop there called Everton 2. So in Liverpool 1, there's a shop called Everton 2. I've seen it, it's a shop, there's nothing more to say. Again, one more topic from Easy Smiles and Expensive Watches, Fuller's London Pride. It's beer. I don't drink beer. I'm not a beer drinker, I just don't. But so I had to Google what kind of beer is London Pride, and I got the answer, it was a premium ale. So I looked into a bit more, what is it? So here we go. London's Fuller Pride. Brewed to 4.1%, this tawny coloured premium ale borrows sweet raisin, biscuit and dried fruit notes from the crystal malt, while fresh piney herbs emanate from the hops. Rich, smooth and elegant on the palate, it draws to a clean, satisfying finish with a beautifully balanced bitterness. I got that description from fullers.co.uk. They brew the stuff, so they should know. Okay. I have something very different here. It's a bit of a change in tone. It's quite different from the others. Again, it's from my friend Kane, and you may have listened to previous episodes with us, such as a deep dive into tea, and the last episode, which was a deep dive into British men's wardrobes. So he does a huge amount of research on British culture. Now this is one which comes from a Canadian, and it was a Canadian physician, a lieutenant colonel in the First World War, and he was presiding over the funeral of a friend, a fellow soldier who died in the Second Battle of Ypres, 1915. And he wrote the poem Flanders Field. So, of course, this is a podcast on British culture, but I don't want to push this one away because it was written by a Canadian. This was first published in Punch magazine, which is a London-based magazine. Normally it's a satirical magazine. It is a humorous, kind of political magazine. And I got a 1915 edition of it recently, and it was really interesting to go through and see how they were reporting then current events. And, of course, there's a mixture of very serious reporting and humorous reporting, cartoons which might have a very serious point. It is an extraordinary magazine. I feel their mantle has now been taken up by Private Eye magazine, but it's very interesting that I say what we generally think of as almost a cartoon for grown-ups, magazine which is really satirical. They published this poem, which was a poem at a funeral, but it's something that's really important, I'd say, in British culture, especially when we remember the soldiers of the First World War. And I understand it's also very important in Canada. So this is the poem Flanders Field by Lieutenant Colonel John McCree. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks sing bravely, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw, the torch be yours to hold it high, If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. Again, this is one that's perhaps quite different from the others, but I felt very important to include it. Again, it was written by a Canadian physician, but it was taken up very much by Punch magazine in London, but then subsequently by a lot of people in the UK. It's common to find, say, a history book called Flanders Fields, and that's how we'd refer to the battlefields in France in the First World War. It's become a common term. So, again, part of our shared culture, I'd say, with the Commonwealth. Something which is very, very important, I think, in British culture. So, from the seriousness and from the importance of From Flanders Fields, we move on to the next topic. Again, suggested to me by somebody on Instagram, Shrublands Fitness. Something packed full of British humour and idiosyncrasies. Something which perhaps upsets me a little bit every time I think of it, is that there's only 12 episodes of this much-loved British TV show. It was created by John Cleese, and I believe it's about the time that they were writing Monty Python's The Life of Brian. They stayed at a hotel in Gleneagles. It was called Gleneagles Hotel. It's in Torquay, Devon. So they stayed there, and they encountered this eccentric hotel owner who seemed to behave as if the worst thing about the hotel were the guests. This whole thing would run so much better if it wasn't for all these people staying here. It's quite extraordinary. In fact, he was said to be so extraordinarily rude. Everybody else left. All the Monty Python crew decided to stay somewhere else. They cancelled their visit. But John Cleese stayed, to the bafflement of everyone else, and they wondered what on earth was he doing staying at a hotel which seemed to have the worst owner in the world. It seems he was doing research. He later on met up with friends working in the hotel business, working as chefs and so on, was asking them, what's the biggest problem you have? And this is how we come to, as I say, a great British comedy show, Fawlty Towers. Fawlty Towers, as I say, just has 12 episodes. The first 6 broadcast in 1975, and then the next 6 broadcast in 79. Each of them are only 30 to 35 minutes long. They're very short, but it has had a huge, huge impact. I should say not everyone likes this comedy show. Richard Ingram's, who is perhaps most famous as being an early editor of Private Eye, which took over from Punch magazine, he gave it a very, very bad review in The Spectator, which is why in the 79 series there is a terrible character called Mr. Ingrams. It's an unusual name, the barb is clear. And people have attempted to remake it. I looked online, I could find 3 attempted remakes of Fawlty Towers just for the American market. Chateau Snavely with Betty White, apparently they produced that in 78, but it didn't go anywhere. Amanda, starring B. Arthur, again switching around some of the genders, that failed. Pain, that failed. But the idea... So it's a very dysfunctional hotel. So Third Rock from the Sun, the creator of that, said that he owed something to Fawlty Towers, and they managed to get, I think very memorably, they managed to get John Cleese in that show. Cheers, in which John Cleese also appeared. Cheers was said to, in the sense of having a dysfunctional workplace family, owed something to it. And Father Ted is said to be an influence, although I have to say, I think Father Ted is maybe an easier watch sometimes, but Fawlty Towers is brilliant. So... Again, we've talked about comedy a few times before. Comedy is always very, very culturally specific. What's funny in one culture often isn't funny in another. That's why translating jokes is so dreadfully difficult, because it comes with so many translators' notes sometimes. But I'd say Fawlty Towers is a pretty accessible one. Perhaps look it up, see what you find. Okay. Thank you very much to Mr. Aussie Bond Guy on Instagram, who suggested F is for the Full Monty, the 1997 film starring Robert Carlyle, who may be familiar to some listeners for playing the Bond villain Renard. Renard in the 1999's The World Is Not Enough. So before he was a Bond villain, he was the Full Monty. It is a film about male strippers. For anyone who's not aware of this, it's out of work steelworkers, don't know what to do, and so they decide, why not strip? Not all strippers strip completely naked, but the Full Monty will. And what I really remember, aside from the fact that it's a fun film, which I have to say doesn't glamorise it and doesn't actually show a lot of stripping. It's mainly the drama between the guys and occasionally their wives and girlfriends and children. it's a kind of a fun and it is a family film. I've watched this, I think, with my parents. I've watched it with my brothers. It's not an embarrassing film to watch with people, I don't think. Maybe it depends on taste, but no, I think it's a fun film. But what I really remember, from 1997 onwards, British newspapers seem to have an endless letters column asking, where did the phrase "the full Monty" come from? So one of them suggested that Field Marshal Montgomery loved a large breakfast, that he actually liked a full English breakfast, all the trimmings, and that's where he got the full Monty, meaning everything. Some people suggested that whilst Montgomery was on campaign in North Africa, that he had to have decoys. They were worried about assassination, so there were people dressed as Montgomery and they would show up, but if it was the full Monty, it was the real guy, and perhaps there's some other phrase for decoys. There's quite a few others, including some kind of Cockney rhyming slang. I fairly recently came across this one. It suggested that it comes from a fella called Montague Maurice Burton. He lived 1885 to 1952, and he was a tailor. He ran a series of Burton shops, one of which was in Sheffield, where the film is set, and allegedly the full Monty is where you have a three-piece suit. You buy everything, which is quite expensive, so if you're having a wedding, you'd ask for the full Monty, all three pieces, which is quite funny, in which case, because then the full Monty originally meant you're fully clothed in a three-piece suit, whereas in the film they use it to mean fully naked. I don't know if that tailoring connection is true. As I say, I've given, I think, 3 or 4 theories where it came from. There's many, many more. Newspapers seem to go for years and years on this. So, from Tailors With Love, Pete Brooker, if you're listening, let me know what you think of the tailoring connection. Matt Spicer, let me know. Matt Spacer, MrBondsuits.com. If you've heard of that, please let me know. Shout out to you two particularly, but to anybody else, well, just tell me, how many theories have you heard of? Where does the full Monty come from? Maybe the best thing about it now in retrospect is that you can watch Reynard, the Bond villain, playing a male stripper. So, from one lively character to another, Spies in Ties suggested this topic, our penultimate topic, which was F is for Falstaff. I really like this idea. Sir John Falstaff is the fictional character who appears in Shakespeare's plays Henry IV Part 1, Part 2, and The Merry Wives of Windsor. Does he appear in Henry V? He's a very close friend of Henry V. He appears in the 3. He's eulogised in the 4th. Now, that hesitation really comes from the fact that often when I've seen dramatisations of Henry V, they will include John Falstaff to show Henry V's character development. So Henry V, of course, a great king who had a wild youth. Part of his wild youth was hanging out with Sir John Falstaff, who is, you could say he's just a fat drunk, and is often portrayed as just a fat drunk, but like all of Shakespeare's characters, he's very, very well-rounded. So whether he's in The Merry Wives of Windsor, or whether you see him in Henry IV, he's a character with a lot of depth and complexity, but again, that's a lot to like all of Shakespeare's characters. So maybe just trying to think which version is the best version to go to. Orson Welles did a 1965 film called Chimes at Midnight, which is sometimes just known as Falstaff, where he compiles the 2 Henry IV films into one storyline with a handful of scenes from Richard II and Henry V. There is a 1989 film of Henry V by Kenneth Branagh that I really, really like, and again that has flashbacks to the previous plays, and it's flashbacks within the time frame of the film that really shows the relationship between the king and his old friend, and how it changes and how Henry has grown. So in some ways, I'd say the deterioration of that friendship shows the character growth of Henry V, but in a very, very tragic way. I have heard of a really good version of these plays, 2012, called The Hollow Crown, and that was it was a TV adaptation with Ben Whishaw, famous for playing Q in James Bond, Jeremy Irons, who I think is just famous for being Jeremy Irons, Tom Hiddleston, who plays Lockie, Benedict Cumberbatch, who's Sherlock, Doctor Strange, and Hugh Bonneville, who I guess most people know from Downton Abbey. I've actually only ever seen one episode of Downton Abbey. I know him from the film Paddington. But again, these are some versions out there of Falstaff, and he's been the inspiration of kind of further plays, modern plays. He's included in all kinds of books. He's even inspired music. So he's an interesting character, but again, part of him is seeing him through, I guess, maybe all the degenerates who are his friends, but also he's friends with the king, and that interesting aspect to his character helps make him three-dimensional. There's a lot of tragedy and humour mixed. That was our penultimate topic. F is for Falstaff. Okay, this is a podcast that a lot of people have found through my Instagram, which is James Bond focused. You can always find me on Instagram. I'm Fleming Never Dies. So perhaps people thought it was too obvious. Only one person, Spies and Ties, suggested F is for Fleming. Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond 007. The 14 books he wrote about the British agent in the 50s and early 60s have obviously had a bit of an influence on my life in terms of me setting up an Instagram account that allowed me to connect with all kinds of wonderful, wonderful people, and has led to me creating this podcast. So if you're listening, gosh, that's had a bit of an influence. Thank you very much for listening, by the way, if you still are. Ian Fleming, I think, is a fantastic writer, and obviously other people have taken up the mantle. The movies, I hear there's one coming. They're pretty good. Video games, they're pretty good. There's also continuation novels, which I must admit, I'm putting it out now. They have never really grabbed me, except for maybe one, which was a young Bond adventure, because it took a very different take. He is somebody who, what can I say, he bottled lightning and was able to write 12 novels, 2 short story compilations, which I'd say are worth a look. If you haven't had a look, have a look. The chances are quite a few people listening have. Why do I like them? I read them when I was at university, and they just hit with me. The first half of the first book, Casino Royale, seemed fairly regular. Seemed alright, I could flick through it, but I have to say there's something that happens partway through that really, really grabbed me and made me interested to read the next book, partly because I was interested in the film License to Kill, which is kind of based on the book Live and Let Die, although the film Live and Let Die is based on another half of it. I don't know, it got me sucked in. A big part of that is his writing style. He has his outlandish plots, which are good. It's a good thread to hang on. All his very, very acrid observations of people and places where he's been, and gosh, his descriptions of food are fantastic. In fact, his descriptions of food are so good that just thinking about his descriptions of food makes me hungry and want to end this podcast. So I am going to wrap up. I didn't really go into Ian Fleming. I might go into James Bond later. I think there's a lot coming up, as I say, with a new film. And if you have looked on YouTube, at my YouTube channel, British Culture, Albion Never Die, same name, you'll see that I've been reviewing some of the books that are on James Bond's bookshelf, desk, table thing, in some of the publicity photos. So perhaps take a look at that. I like how one interest can lead on to more and more kind of other diverse interests. So, F is for fish and chips. I nearly did F is for Fleming, but I really had to go with the majority vote. F is for fish and chips. I hope you enjoyed it. And again, if you really, really enjoyed it, please feel free to review it. All honest 5-star reviews are welcome. And so I've done A, B, C, D, E, F. If you can work out what letter is next, it took me a while, then please message me. I especially appreciate things such as G is for gnome. If the G sound is not the hard G sound, that just amuses me. So anyway, G, possibly for gnome, is coming up in a couple of weeks. But the next episode next week, will be a full in-depth review of all those books that I'm talking fairly briefly about on YouTube. So if you know them, if you've read them, if you have any thoughts or opinion on them, do message me, and I'll include your views and your comments, as I always do. Thank you to everybody who contributed to this episode. I very, very much appreciate you getting involved. It makes it worthwhile for me to do it. Allows me to look into some things that I might not otherwise have looked into. I didn't know that origin story of Fortnum Mason until somebody suggested it. So again, thank you to everybody, and yeah, what can I say? I'm in the United States, so I feel I have to say it. Have a nice day.